Wachsmann.
You're recording? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Let me take the thing out. Hi, everyone. Let me change so that I can see. The reason we are sitting is so that people can see us in Zoom and everything. So apologies for those back here that don't see me. Anyway, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Shelley Wachsmann today for his presentation. More than anything, it is an honor for me because I would not be here in marine archaeology were not for Shelley. He was part of my, I was part of his project. He was the first field project that I had. So I'm very excited to be able to be here and introduce Shelley. Let me see. Is this?
Oh, let's try and get this
Oh,
out
no.
for a minute.
Okay, Shelley was born in Canada and immigrated to Israel in 1968. He earned all three of his degrees in Near Eastern archaeology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's Institute of Archaeology, a BA in 74, master's in 84, and PhD in 1990s. From the 1976 to 1989, Shelley, Professor Wachsmann, served as Inspector of Underwater Antiquities for the Israel Department of Antiquities and Museums. During that time, he was directly responsible for the nautical heritage of Israel. He carried out numerous underwater archaeological surveys and excavations in the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and the Sea of Galilee. Among the projects he directed were the excavation of a late Bronze Age cargo ship of late Bronze Age cargo off the Carmel coast, probe excavations of the late 5th century BC wreck near Kibbutz Ma'agan Michael, a 6th century AD Byzantine wreck of Dor, and the search for cannon jettisoned by Napoleon during his retreat from Akko in 1799. In 1986, he directed the excavation of the Sea of Galilee boat, a 2,000-year-old boat found in the Sea of Galilee near the ancient site of Migdal. At the completion of the excavation, the boat was moved intact to a conservation pool at the Yigal Allon Museum at nearby Kibbutz Ginosar, where it is now on exhibit. Beginning in 1990, Wachsmann became Meadows' visiting assistant professor of biblical archaeology in the nautical archaeology program at Texas A&M University. In 1993, this chair was converted to a tenure track position to which Wachsmann was appointed. And in 1999, he received tenure and promotion to associate professor. And in 2010, he was promoted to full professor. Wachsmann has published 6 books and over 100 articles on the results of his field research and other archaeological subjects. His third book, The Sea of Galilee Boat, an extraordinary 2,000-year-old discovery, won the Biblical Archaeology Society's award for Best Popular Book, published in Archaeology in 1995 to 96. This book has gone through 4 editions as well as appearing as an audiobook. His fourth book, Seagoing Ships and Seamanship in the Bronze Age Levant, received an Irene Levy Sala Book Prize in the Archaeology of Israel in the popular book category from 98 to 99. His Gurov ship card model and its Mediterranean context won the Nautical Archaeology Society's 2013 Keith McElroy Award, jointly with Professor Sir Barry Conlife's book, Britain Begins. His most recent published book, Understanding the Boat from the Time of Jesus, Galilean Seafaring, appeared in 2015, and his 7th book, The Late Bronze Age Metal Artifacts of Hahotrim in Israel, is currently under review. Wachsmann has carried out extensive field work in the Eastern Mediterranean. These works include, but is not limited to, the following projects. In 1994 to 96, he directed the INAS CMS joint expedition to Tantura Lagoon, which discovered and documented 7 shipwrecks in the ancient port of Dor on Israel's northern Mediterranean coast. In 1997, he directed a survey of Ashkelon on its southern coast. In 1998, he recorded the Abu el Hagag festival in Luxor, Egypt, in which boats are transported as part of the festival, a custom that may have its genesis in pharaonic times. In 1999, he directed the Robo Shipwreck Survey, which carried out a side scan sonar expedition in search of shipwrecks opposite Tantura Lagoon to a depth of 100 meters. It was very cool to be part of that project too. In 2002, he directed a paleoenvironmental survey of 3 possible Phoenician anchorage in Portugal. In 2003 to 2006, he directed the Canadian team of a joint Canadian and Greek expedition in search of fleets lost during the Persian War in the early 5th century BC. In 2007 to 2009, he led the Danaus project, a deep water survey studying Crete to Egypt trade routes in antiquity. In 2012, under the aegis of Dr. Johan van Tilburg's Eastern Island Statue Project, Wachsmann directed a study of maritime aspects of the Rapa Nui culture, which included the first remote sensing survey of the crater lake at the statue quarry of Raraku. Most recently, under the aegis of the Jaffa Cultural Heritage Project, and with the goal of better understanding the maritime dimensions of the port of Jaffa, Israel, he directed the 2014 IOPA Maritime Project, which combined a geoarchaeological and geophysical land survey together with a deepwater remote operated vehicle ROV examination of multi-beam survey anomalies at depths of 50 to 250 meters. Today, Professor Wachsmann will be sharing with us his presentation on the interpretation of watercraft in ancient art. Thank you very much, Professor Wachsmann.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me here. As Isabel told you, I've spent a lot of time in Israel. I spent a lot of time in Texas. So I will greet you with the traditional greeting, which is howdy and shalom, y'all. So give me 1 minute and I'll share the screen here. 1 second. Okay, I'm working off 2 computers here, so I hope this works. The background to today's talk is that in 2019, one of our PhD students walked into my office and she was doing research on ships depicted in medieval illuminated volumes. And she asked me a really simple question. How do I interpret ancient ship iconography? And I went and said, well, and then I stopped because I realized there wasn't a single publication that really covered most of the issues with how to interpret iconography. So I put aside the book I was working on and sat down for the rest of that year and wrote an article, this is a small part of that article. So, and I did that because I've been working on ship iconography since the 1970s, since I was a graduate student. So you came out today, I think it's a good idea to sort of explain to you why it was worthwhile coming out today. So there are a few basic things I want to cover first, and that is, why ancient iconography? Why should we be interested in ancient images? Why are they important? Then, why are we interested in imagery of ancient ships? Old wooden hulls. And then what I'm going to do is take 2 examples of approaches to interpreting iconography. It's just 2 for many, but just 2 that I chose. So first of all, why iconography? The simple answer is that we need to look at the past through as many avenues as possible. Perhaps the best way to explain why we need all types of evidence is to try to reconstruct the past is the famous story of the blind man and the elephant in India, where blind men were brought before an elephant, and each one who had never seen an elephant, didn't know what it looked like, and each one touched a different part of the elephant. They came to the conclusion that an elephant was in turn a snake, a spear, a hand fan, a wall, or a pillar. The last man touched the tail and realized that all the others were wrong. An elephant was obviously mostly like a rope. There's a delightful children's poem that goes, and so these men disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. This parable lies at the essence of any study of the past. We who study the past, and now that includes everybody who's in this room and watching this lecture, because we're studying the past, we're like those blind men. We can touch the past, but we can't see it. Viewing the past through any single lens, say archaeology or ancient texts or any other method of doing it, is going to end up being myopic. What we want to do is touch as many parts of the elephant as possible. And even then we may come up with an elephant like I just showed you, right? We are not seeing the past. And I think we fool ourselves if we think that we really understand as much as we do understand. So that's why we need iconography, right? It's another way of touching the elephant. It's another way of viewing the past. Next question is this: why should we care about old ships? Well, I think in this group, I don't have to convince you, but consider throughout human existence, watercraft have been among the most complex artifacts created by any culture that had ships. Even today, spacecraft, spaceships arguably fit this description. Simply put, we cannot imagine a past in which vessels did not play a crucial role in exploration, migration, trade, and war in one time or another. In fact, just about everything that humans have ever made or used has been carried by ship. I kid you not, including the pyramids. The casing of the pyramids, remember the pyramids used to be shiny white. You would have had to wear your Ray-Bans when you were looking at them. They were covered with casing from the Tura quarries, which are on the east side of the Nile. So the blocks actually had to be brought over by ship from the other side of the Nile. So even parts of the pyramids were carried on that. Evidence for seafaring may go back into the lower Paleolithic period around 200,000 years ago. Yet until recently, our knowledge of ancient vessels themselves remained limited. The study of shipwrecks, their hulls and their contents only really began with the introduction of scuba in the midst of World War II. First truly scientific underwater excavation of a shipwreck was carried out by the late George Bass in 1960 at Cape Caledonia on the southern coast of Turkey. Since that time, archaeologists have discovered, excavated, studied, and published numerous shipwrecks around the world. And nautical archaeology as a discipline has contributed immeasurably to an understanding of our collective maritime past. Despite this cornucopia of information, ancient shipwrecks can only tell us part of their stories. And there are two reasons for this. First, oops, I am not showing are they seeing these slides?
Yeah.
Then oh, okay. Hold on. Okay. First, nautical archaeologists quite literally are not playing with a full deck. For some periods, say the Byzantine and medieval periods, there are numerous shipwrecks that have been discovered and excavated and studied. But there are other cultures and periods, such as the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Sea Peoples. We don't have a splinter of wood from any of their ships. None have ever been found. So without contemporaneous depictions, we would have basically nothing. Another issue is that in most cases, only the lower portions of hulls survive. These are the parts that were buried in sediment, like sand, mud, and clay soon after the sinking event. Very little, if any, of the upper structure, and I'm talking about ancient shipwrecks, not things that sank 100 years ago. Very little, if any, of the upper structure organic contents or rigging survive. During or after storms and battles, masts, sails, and rigging may have been lost or intentionally cut away. Vessels that sink in deep water will consistently land upright on the seabed. This is something I learned from Bob Bow. It doesn't matter which way it goes down. If it's going down deep water, it will sit upright on the seabed. That's not always the case with ships that sink in shallower waters, but it's generally the case there also. For ancient wrecks, there's only really a handful of wrecks that were found basically upside down. So we know very little about the upper parts of the hull of these ships. This is what you usually see on a shipwreck in the Mediterranean. Only non-organic objects, usually amphoras. This is why we find so many cargo ships, because the amphoras are sticking out. That's all you see. There's no hull, right? It's not like in Pirates of the Caribbean where everything's still out there. Yeah, so organic materials like wooden hulls, unprotected by sediment, disappear over time due to waterlogging. Waterlogging is a term for the leaching out of water-soluble elements, organic acids, starches, and sugars. This, together with the destruction carried out by a variety of wood-eating boring mollusks, bacteria, and to a lesser degree fungi, eventually consume all traces of exposed timbers and other organic materials that remain exposed in the water column. The lucky parts of the hull are anything that gets buried quickly, fairly quickly after the sinking or the deposition event. On average, only about 10% of an ancient wooden planked hull's original structure survives. The only place that is different in the area of the Mediterranean is the Black Sea because of its anoxic lower levels. And there they're finding shipwrecks that are actually standing proud in the water column. It's unbelievable. But you would never see a ship of this age in the Mediterranean that would look like that. Just to show you how important iconography is. So this is a fairly well-known image of the Ulbrun shipwreck that was published by George Best at National Geographic in 1987. If you sort of look at it, the bottom part was based actually on the excavation, but there was virtually nothing of the upper parts of the hull. So the upper parts of the hull are taken almost directly from the Syro-Canaanite ships in the tomb of Khenamun at Thebes. So we see that shipwrecks and iconography actually go hand in hand. Iconography gives you what's above the waterline, and the archaeology gives you what's below for the most part, gives you what's below the waterline. But I have to say the interpretation of imagery itself, and I'll call it iconography, just pictures of any images of any sort, come with their own set of challenges. And I'm now going to show you an image that you probably would not expect to see in a lecture on archaeology dealing with iconography and ships. It's this one. In a series of paintings, the famous Belgian surrealist artist René Magritte placed the statement "Ceci n'est pas une pipe" beneath a smoker's pipe. It's not a pipe. What is it? It's an image of a pipe. When studying ship iconography, we have to keep this point in mind. A depiction is not the object itself. And this is often forgotten by, I can't tell you how many publications I've seen where people actually say, oh, it's a ship, right? No, it's an image of a ship. And the results of the image can depart considerably from the actual watercraft that is being represented. And there are a variety of reasons for this, which include, but are not limited to, the artist's or the artisan's capability, familiarity with the prototype vessel, sources of information, difficulties in translating the shape and details of the prototype into the chosen medium, whether it's a model, two-dimensional drawing. Was the artist using art canons, or did he just do his own thing? All these things can play into changes to the image that make it very much unlike the original, the prototype. So that's just sort of a tiny touch of some of the issues to consider. And what I'd like to do now is take two examples, and I'm going to, of iconography of ships. And I'd like to start with the Panathenaic ships. Now, the Athenian Panathenaia was the traditional birthday of Athena, the patron goddess of the ancient Greek city-state of Athens. This celebration took place at the end of the month of Hekatombeon, the first month of the Athenian calendar, which usually fell in the summer. This was the equivalent of Christmas time for the ancient Athenians. As part of the ceremony, on the final day of celebration, Athena received a special garment, a peplos, brought to her in a suitable and impressive procession. Panathenaia is thought, the festival is thought to have been established in Athens no later than the 7th century BC. In the mid-6th century BC, athletic games, possibly including ship races, were held every 4 years. This special celebration was known as the Great Panathenaia to differentiate it from the Lesser Panathenaia that took place in the 3 interceding years. For much of antiquity, on the occasion of the Great Panathenaia, a ship on wheels, right, a ship that never saw water below its hull, known as the Panathenaic ship, brought the peplos to the Acropolis. Indeed, the custom of using a ship continued down to the last recorded celebration of the Panathenaia in AD 410. Now, the famous Elgin marbles, what they're showing you is the Panathenaia, the celebration of the Panathenaia. They're from the Temple of Athena, the Parthenon, on the Athenian Acropolis. Unfortunately, although the Parthenon frieze shows the peplos itself, or may show the peplos itself, already on the Acropolis, the Panathenaic ship does not appear on the marbles that were decorating the Parthenon. That there's two possibilities for that. One is the ship never actually made it up to the Acropolis. That was not possible. The other possibility is that the proportions of the ship, there would have been a problem with the proportions of this very large vessel as opposed to humans, and perhaps that was the reason. At any rate, it's not on the Elgin marble. During the festival, the Panathenaic ship was towed along a route from Kerameikos Gate to the Acropolis. And the most important, and the problem is we have very few images of this. We have references to it, but we have textual references, but we have very few images of it. And the best known and the most detailed representation, and you'll see this is not saying a lot, it appears on what is known as the calendar frieze, which today is a pagan calendar of Athens, which is placed on the on a Byzantine church, the small metropolitan church of St. Eleutheros in downtown Athens. This is the church. It's located in just north of the Acropolis, near Odos Metropolou. And the calendar, the calendar is located here. Sorry. The frieze contains a visual display of the 12 Athenian months, the symbols of the main festivals that took place during each one. The frieze is composed of 2 long, narrow blocks that had been removed from the older building. The date of the calendar frieze is debated, and opinions range from the late Hellenistic period to as late as the 2nd century AD. So this is the only representation for which there can be no doubt that it does depict the Panathenaic ship. So it sort of becomes the gold standard against which all others must be measured, despite its limitations, and the limitations are many. First, the ship has been all but obliterated by a Byzantine cross set as inside a rondel. In creating the cross, the artisans carved out all the spaces between the arms, removing any vestiges of the ships themselves. Additionally, the outer edge of the surrounding circle was carved out. And there is a horizontal crack in the rock that has destroyed some of the upper parts of the scene. Also, much of the ship is hidden behind white splotches, like this one, possibly of lichen or plaster, which may be obscuring additional details. And finally, the surface of the cross's arms, this part here, appear to have been smoothed out, removing any plastic relief, although some carved lines are still visible. Taken together, that's not a lot to work with. Again, we're clearly not playing with a full deck here. The fact that much of the scene had been destroyed or hidden may explain why, although everyone discussing the calendar frieze mentions the Panathenaic ship, in passing, to the best of my knowledge, no one had actually tried to take a closer look at the ship itself to see what it can tell, the ship depiction to tell us what it can tell us, to see what it can tell us. So let's take a look at it. Let's start. So despite all the problems that we can, what can we learn from the representation of a Panathenaic ship and its overland conveyance? Let's start with the bottom up with its transport mechanism. The ship was conveyed on 4 sets of wheels. 2 sets are situated just beneath the bow to the right of the roundel. And although partially destroyed, the 2 rear wheels still survive, near wheels still survive on the raised surface of their roundel. They were presumably attached to some type of wagon, but we see no evidence of the wagon itself. The fact that the ship required 4 sets of wheels is remarkable in itself. It indicates that the Panathenaic was an actual ship and not a float in the shape of a watercraft, not something flimsy. It was very heavy, very massive. There's no evidence for spokes on the wheels, suggesting that these are sturdy wheels made out of solid wooden discs, although I remind you that this was probably originally painted, and some of the detail may have been in paint. But the fact that there are four sets of wheels sort of suggests that's not the case, that these are really, discs of wood, and this is a very heavy ship. The only other example I know that I can compare to that is the funerary ship of the Apis bull from the Ptolemaic period from Egypt. And there are several representations of this conveyance in Cairo and the Louvre. Again, notice that the wheels are apparently made of solid discs of wood. This is very much unlike the Dionysiac ship cart, which was also from another festival of the Athenians. And the Dionysian ship cart was this very flimsy affair. It's not even clear if it was a ship. It might have been just a float that had stuff attached to it that made it look like a boat. You can see even the wheels have spokes. So the ship's bow. The ship is facing right with the bow visible to the right of the roundel. The bow indicates that the ship. The bow with its ram indicates that the ship replicates an archaic war galley complete with a chisel-shaped waterline ram. What's missing is the typical boarhead decoration of the ram. Above the ram is a thick line that rises at a slight angle. This represents the proembolion or foreram. The proembolion was a subsidiary projection capping the massive longitudinal whales that met here. A barely perceptible downward curving line ends at the tip of the ram. This probably represents the massive starboard whale. Whale as in W-A-L-E, not W-H-L-A-L-E. A whale is a nautical term for longitudinal strengthening timbers that run the length of the hull. In a warship, a pair of whales would engage the ram. Otherwise, if you rammed the ship, you were more likely to come apart than the ship that you rammed. The ship's forecastle sits above the prow and bowline and is surrounded by a screen. A line bisects the forecastle horizontally, and this is a common feature in depictions of archaic galleys. Now, returning to the ship itself, the line of the keel can be followed here, here, and here. They're just fragments of lines. This allows us in broad brush stroke to approximately reconstruct the curve of the hull, like so. Similarly, a horizontal line on the bottom arm of the cross may indicate the shear strake or top of the hull. Right, that's there. So we can add another broad brush stroke there. This confirms that the ship representation is what we might call horizontally challenged. What happened was the artisans, when they were making the calendar frieze, had only so much space to devote to each month. So this is a very squat image of, and again, we come back to this is not a pipe. The ship it's depicting, the original ship did not look like this. It would have been much longer because it's now clear that they're copying a archaic galley. So basically what's happened is they've taken the center of the hull, the center of the hull, and just removed it and put the bow and the stern and stuck them together. At the stern, a deeply cut sinuous line survives, and below it we see the blade of the starboard quarter rudder. This gives the angle, and we'll get to this in a minute, this gives the angle of the rudder's loom, even though we don't have the loom itself. And that's going to be important later. At the stern, a deeply cut sinuous line that you can see there in the upper right survives, and below it, oh, I'm sorry, reading the same notes. Only remnants of the ship's mast and sail still exist. These include a short molded protrusion at the top of the roundel just to the right of center. This detail is always in the shadows. I went a number of times to try to photograph it. It was just virtually impossible. It appears best in the slant view. If the line is continued downward, we end with a forward raking that is leaning mast stepped aft to the midships. That is, the mast is based in the stern of a ship and leans forward. No actual ship could ever have a single mast so far astern. But remember, this is not a ship. This is a representation of a ship. Perhaps the mast was moved astern to better display Athena's peplos, which served as its sail. So here we have the mast. Along the outside of the upper right quadrant of the circles and rising above the ship's bow are three roughly triangular bulges. Another fragment of an incised line here on the upper arm of the cross may also be related to the sail system. The bulges to the right of the roundel may be identified as the billowing lead edge of a brailed sail, a detail often paralleled in representations of ships under sail. So now we can add at least a partial sail to this scene. The incised line on the upper arm of the cross may be connected to the sail, but there simply isn't enough evidence to reconstruct the entire sail. It's interesting that the sail is shown billowing. Perhaps this is what Philostratus had in mind when he wrote in the 3rd century AD. Moreover, I've been told the following facts concerning the Panathenaic festival. The robe of Athena that was hung on the ship was more charming than any painting with folds that swelled in the breeze. Now, we may have an actual model of the Panathenaic ship hiding in plain view. This is known as the Eryththean model. This bronze model is in the shape of an archaic galley, but it has an oil lamp at its bow. It was found in the Eryththeon, which is that's where the caryatids are, on the Acropolis. This is a temple on the Athenian Acropolis dedicated to both Athena and Poseidon. In this slide, I'm showing you a line drawing of the model before it was cleaned. Charles Boteker, the excavator, originally identified the model as an ex-voto, that is a cultic gift to Poseidon. From that, he argued for a cult of Poseidon at the Erechtheum. Unfortunately for his theory, cleaning the model revealed an inscription written in stippling on the port side, which read, "Holy to Athena." So here's the problem. The model depicts an archaic period of worship, say 6th century BC, but the form of the letters indicates that the inscription on the model dates to the 4th century BC. The circumstances of the model's discovery indicate clearly that it was an ex voto, that is a religious offering given in order to fulfill a vow, donated to the Erechtheim, not an accidental artifact from the earlier era at the site. Thus, the model's internment must postdate the completion of the Erechtheim in 406 BC. The date of both the internment and the inscription are curious, again, because there seems to be a disparity of date between the two. J.S. Morrison, in his monumental book, Greek Word Ships, notes that the model could have been around for an extended time, could have been made, say, in the 6th century BC, and then somebody donated it in the 4th century, much later, and that's when it was inscribed. The simpler solution to this conundrum, though, is to assume that the model represents a contemporaneous 4th century BC Panathenaic ship that was in the form of an older archaic ship. In that case, the model's inscription could have been added soon after it was manufactured in the 4th century BC. In the past, several scholars suggested that this model represents the Panathenaic ship. The first of those was T.S. Pitakis in 1862, and more recently Hans Gunther Martin in 1999. So is this a Panathenaic ship? Well, we have to go back to the calendar frieze and compare it and see whether the two are alike. So how does the Erechtheim model stack up? The line of the model's keel is slightly rockered and curves gently. Oops. Right? Similar to what we saw, but that's not surprising. Similar to what we saw on the calendar frieze. The model has a remarkable chisel-shaped waterline ram. Right. At least in profile, this is absolutely identical to the ram on the calendar frieze. The oil lamp, which is this thing here, sits above the bow, and that has caused, and again, this comes back to this is not a pipe, that has caused the forecastle, the artisan had to move the forecastle back. That's due to this being not just an ex-voto, but also a lamp. But when seen in profile, the lamp looks almost like the proembolian, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. Yeah. Here we have, yeah, so that's the forecastle again, and look how similar it is to the Panathenaic ship on the calendar relief. The ship has 4 beams in it. 3 of them are internal beams, and then the 4th is a through beam. That is a beam that actually goes through, and this is the beam at the stern where the quarter rudders would have been attached. And this becomes important also when we try to compare the 2 images. And here you can see an example of a through beam on a archaic galley. This also is something that appears on this railing appears on ships. of this period. And also bird heads are very common in this period, just like what we see at the stern here. This is a rather unusual one, but it fits within the group. We have what may be a decoration that may represent a whale here. But the most important thing is it's sort of like the dog that didn't bark. What's missing here? What it does not have. One is struck by an element that is missing on the model of a 4th century BC ship worthy of being dedicated to Athena. There's no evidence for an outrigger. As can be seen here, on the contemporaneous galley, that is 4th century BC galley of the Nike of Samothrace. The outrigger was a normal feature from the 5th century onward for all Greek galleys, triremes, and larger, which allowed them to have more rowers on board. So what happens if we try to compare these two images? Now remember, they're in 2 different mediums. They could be from 2 different periods. They may even represent 2 different iterations of the Panathenaic ship. So this is, I'm just drawing the lines that we had before. And if we move the bow of the Archean model up to the Panathenaic ship, it's almost identical. There are 2 things that really stick out here. One is that the forecastles move back, but we know why that is, right? Because of the lamp. And the other thing is that the Archean model does not have that subsidiary ram. And I'll talk about that later. Now, if we move the stern up, we basically see the same thing. I've aligned it so that the loom of the quarter rudder aligns with the through beam, and this is kind of remarkable because it's not exact, but it's so close given all the issues here that it's kind of it demonstrates that these are representing the same, probably the same ship, although possibly not the same iteration of the ship. In other words, this is about as good as we can expect it to get. So one of the questions is, how do we explain the massive proembolian on the calendar frieze that's missing on the Archean model? And there are 2 possible explanations for this disparity. First, as I already mentioned, perhaps the model's lamp was meant to do double duty, as in profile the lamp had a somewhat similar shape. Second, and I think a more likely explanation, is that any ship used in a procession over centuries had to be refurbished or replaced on occasion. Thus, the model and the frieze may be representations of 2 entirely different iterations of the Panathenaic ships. We know that the Panathenaic ships underwent refurbishing and even possible replacement at times. For example, in the Athenian inscription dating to 287 BC, the comic poet Philippides is praised for having influenced King Lysimachus of Thrace for the giving to the goddess for the peplos at the Panathenaia, a mast and a yardarm. So, in summary, consider the evidence in favor of the Archean model representing a contemporaneous Panathenaic ship. First, the Archean model agrees remarkably well in shape with the Panathenaic ship portrayed in the calendar frieze. The model comes from the Archean and is dedicated to Athena. What vessel could be more appropriate to donate to Athena than the Panathenaic ship? The model replicates an archaic galley, yet the dedicatory inscription dates to the 4th century BC. The simplest explanation of this paradox is that the donor commissioned a lamp in the form of the existing Panathinaik ship, had the model engraved with an appropriate dedicatory inscription, and gave it to the Erythraean all in the 4th century, but it's representing the Panathinaik ship, which is copying an archaic ship. Okay, kind of complicated, but that's what we've got. If we've got time, I've got one more rather short example of some of the approaches to iconography, and this is one for the books. I like to, oops, I'm sorry, I wasn't keeping up with the slides here. I like to call this the curious case of Noah's box. It's a strange fact that during the 1st millennium AD, artists depicted Noah's Ark not in the shape, not in a ship-like manner in the way we think of it today, but rather as a box on 4 legs. When I first saw this, that was a real head scratcher for me. Perhaps the best example of this phenomenon is the well-preserved scene from Mopsuestia, Turkey. This comes from a structure identified as either a synagogue or a church dating to the 5th century AD. Similar scene is known from the synagogue at Hukok near the Sea of Galilee in Israel, but it's badly damaged. All you see is the bottom of the box/ark. And again, surprisingly, in both scenes, the artists depict Noah's Ark clearly as a box with an open, well, at least at Mopsuestia, with an open lid on 4 legs. So what's going on here? The earliest representation of Noah's Ark appears on a series of coins from the ancient pagan site of Apamea Kibotos, modern Dinar, in Western Turkey. These are also apparently, as best as I can understand, the earliest known depictions of any biblical scenes, because Jews were iconoclasts at the beginning of the 1st millennium AD. The series spans the reigns of the Roman emperors Septimius Severus to Trebonianus Gallus, that is from the end of the 2nd century to the middle of the 3rd century AD. On the coin type's reverse, Noah and his wife stand inside the ark. The ark itself is depicted as a box with an open lid, complete with the identifier Noah. Oops, sorry. Noah, underlined here in red. Above the box open lid appear a dove bearing an olive branch and a raven. Genesis chapter 6, verses 6-12. The Apameans perhaps found this scene attractive because their city's epithet was Kibotos, which means, in Greek, it means box. Alternately, there is a tradition that places Mount Ararat in the region of Apamea. And this too might explain the strange appearance of biblical motif on the coinage of a pagan city. The early church fathers, who considered Noah representative of the Church of Jesus, interpreted the story of Noah's Ark as one of redemption and salvation. So the deluge cycle became a common theme in early Egyptian art. In one of the earliest Christian representations, dating to the early 4th century AD, Noah appears alone standing in an ark in the shape of a box floating on water. Dating to around AD 500, the Ashburnham Pentateuch depicts Noah's Ark as a box on legs. The same way the other early Christian representations of Noah's Ark depict it as a roughly cube-shaped box, sometimes on legs, typically with the cover open, with the top open. Now, irrespective of your personal views on whether Noah's Ark ever existed or not, I think we can all agree that it would not have looked like a box on legs, right? And yet, no doubt about it, in the early 1st millennium AD, Jews, Christians, and even pagans conceived of Noah's Arks as a box. This is truly one for the books. So how are we to make sense of this oddity? Paul R. Trebilko, in his book on early Jewish communities of Turkey, followed earlier writers considering the Apamean coins to derive from an earlier Hellenistic artistic tradition that depicted mythological pairs of characters, Auge and Telephus, Danae and Perseus, on the sea in boxes. And this explanation is possible, but the truth is these myths have nothing to do with the flood story. In both cases, they're talking about a mother and a son that are sent out in a box on the sea so that they would drown, but the person didn't have to kill them, right? So alternately, the ark may have served as an allegory for a sarcophagus, bringing salvation to the dead in Christian funerary art. Nevertheless, the actual shape of the ark as it's portrayed is that of a box and not of a sarcophagus. So what do we do? Well, a clue to the enigma may come from a Greek inscription on the open cover in the Mapsuestia scene. It reads, Kibotos Noe Ar. The late Michael Abiona renders this as either the Ark of Noah, the Redeemer, or the Redeeming Ark of Noah. But the kibotos in Greek, as noted, means quite literally a box, right? So here, instead of looking at the iconography, we have to go to the text. In the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the term for Noah's Ark is teva. It appears only twice in the Bible, once in two stories. One, the story of Noah's Ark, the other, the basket in which the baby Moses is put on the Nile, right? And the term itself may come from a Babylonian term, subu, which is a type of ship that appears in Babylonian texts. The Bible, however, employs an entirely different Hebrew term, aron, for the Ark of the Covenant. The same Hebrew term is used then again for Joseph's coffin when he's brought out of Egypt. So that's the Hebrew. Enter the Septuagint. This is a Greek translation of the Bible that was done under the Ptolemies in Egypt. It's also known as the 70, because the tradition is that it was written by 70 or 72 Jewish scholars, each placed in a room, and each one wrote the exact same thing. What happens is there's sort of a I don't want to say bait and switch, but there's a switching of terms from the Hebrew to the Greek. And look what happens. In the Septuagint, Noah's Ark and the Ark of the Covenant are called a kibotos, a box, while baby Moses' basket is called, in Greek, is called a thebis. So what happens here, what appears to have happened here is that, and this isn't the only example of it, the Septuagint was so, by this time the Jews were not, Hebrew was going out as a spoken language, right? It was a holy language, but it wasn't a spoken language. And it seems that they're coming to their conclusions based on the Greek translation. At least that's the best explanation I can give for this. Anyhow, those were the two examples that I gave you. If anybody's interested in this topic, this is the article that everything I'm talking about here is based on. It's free for download on the internet. And as they say in Texas, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. And I apologize for trying to do two computers and move all the details together. I didn't always synchronize that. So, any questions? Yeah.
I have it's really a comment on your last example. And I was thinking the same, when you explained how the Greek depictions are of a box, I was thinking the Hebrew, about Noah, and it really does make sense, I think, that when people work with the translation of the original ancient text, in this case Hebrew, things get distorted. I mean, we have the same thing with the notion of copper in the Hebrew Bible, Nahoshet. it's always translated as bronze, you
Mhm.
know, in the St. James and so on translations, and it distorts what the actual material culture would look like.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Right. Yeah, and same thing with, not exactly the same thing, but Yam Suf, the Red Sea,
Yes.
which in Hebrew, Yam is sea, Suf is reed. So it's not the Red Sea, it's the Reed Sea. And I'm not sure quite how it got the name Red Sea, but already in the Chronicles and Kings, Yam Suf is referred to as what we think of as the Red Sea. But there was a fantastic article in Biblical Archaeology Review a while ago, in which I want to say Hoffmeyer was pointed out that under Ramses II, there was actually a term Sea of Reeds. And that's the only period where you have that term.
Mhm.
Yes. Hi.
I once heard that the word used for art, Noah's Ark, was a word that meant something like something that brings life or something that preserves life. And I was wondering, like, this translation, the both translated the same word, could that have been sort of a symbolic work, like an intentional thing?
It might be. I don't think they did anything not intentionally, but it's a change in the terminology. And the fact that Teva twice is referred to in terms of something that carries people, right, indicates that it is some kind of watercraft. And the suggestion, not mine, that it comes from a Babylonian term for a type of ship called Subu makes sense to me. That you know. Yes.
Hi, Shelley. Thank you so much for a great talk. A lot of these conversations about iconography and models remind me a lot of the work of Julian Wainwright and Charlotte Dixon at the University of Southampton. And a lot of their conversations have centered on what is the difference between boat building knowledge and artisanal knowledge, and where are these gaps, and what is communicated, what is the most, what elements are seen probably as being the most valuable. And so looking at these examples, I'm just curious on your thoughts on, do you find those, like this idea of boat building knowledge in here, what is missing, what is, what is emphasized in this case?
Yeah, one of the things, I think there are two major issues. One is whether the person is working according to a specific art canon. Like if you're working in Egyptian art, in the classical example of that is the naval, not sea, but naval battle at Medinat Habu, where people talk about the 5 ships of the sea peoples, right? They're not 5 ships, they're 5 depictions of a single image, right? After the battle, somebody went around, drew a ship, and there are 5 copies in varied details. Now there you've got other problems that if you have to know how the wall, what it looked like originally. Originally, they put the stones on the wall, they smoothed it, they plastered it, they then carved and painted the plaster. Over time, the plaster fell off, and what we have is the negative. It's basically the skeleton, right? So again, we're not playing with the full deck. This is why I love that story of the blind man and the elephant, because I read not so many articles where everybody's so sure of themselves, and I think we shouldn't be sure of ourselves. We know very little. You know, the old, honest to God, I bet you have the same feeling. The older I get, the more I realize how little I know. It's just the awesomeness of what we don't know. The other thing is you can have something that you'll see, for example, is if the artist isn't working according to an art style, he's just, some shepherd scratching away on a rock, he will emphasize the things that impressed him and ignore other things, totally ignore them. So that the ship, if something really impressed him, that'll be big, and the other things will be so small, right? For example, during the Mycenaean ships these are like they're incredibly important because these are these are the forerunners of the trireme and all the later ships. It had an open rowers gallery, right? And there were stanchions that supported beams that could support a central deck. This central rowers gallery, which just looks sort of I call it a ladder lying on its side. That must have really impressed these guys, because sometimes you'll see there are depictions of Mycenaean ships in which there's no hull, there's just this, there's the top and bottom of that. So that's another thing. And there are a lot of other details, but I think the main takeaway is that you're not looking at ships, you're looking at depictions of ships, and you have to be you can get information out of it. I think it's incredible. It's absolutely, along with archaeology, there was a lot of stuff we wouldn't know with iconography, but everything comes with its own, you need to interpret it. You can't just look at it and, this is a photograph in time. Plus, remember, these guys weren't ethnographers. They weren't, nautical archaeologists. They didn't care if, the hull was put together with peg mortise and tenon joints, or it was framed first, or yeah.
I find it very interesting. We did a research 15 years ago on the depictions of ships in the Spanish defense system in Puerto Rico. And we identified two different types of drawing. You have the depictions, like the ones that you have been discussing, that are official, either made by an artisan or made by somebody that has been commissioned to do this drawing. But we have the graffiti, which is apocryphal. We don't know who made it. It's part of the experience, daily experience. And I find it very interesting that one of the ship that you have that has the carving on it, like a dedication, that also we see it even in the 16th, 17th, even up to the 19th century in the areas that we are working on. And what I find interesting is the meaning on why to do this type of drawing and where do we find them. And usually we find them in places where people spend a long time, but also where people are worried about others. So there was, to some point, there were some concepts where we were thinking, and I wanted to get your opinion on this. In this graffiti, we also see what you're saying of areas that are emphasized, but we were thinking that it's possible that it has to do with a religious offering, like a religious offering, like wishing well to the people who are going on the journey by those who are staying behind. Not just I saw a nice boat and I draw it, but it also had a meaning of within the society, within the cosmology and the worldview of the drawer and of the maritime environment.
There's a great article on that. Harry Salas, who used to put on a wonderful series of conferences on Mediterranean seafaring called Tropis. By the way, you can download all of them from the INA website, along with Lucien Bash's The Musée Imaginaire, which is like an incredible volume collection of Mediterranean iconography of ships. Harry wrote an article about a iconographer, a Greek Orthodox painter who paints in Greek Orthodox churches. And he had been commissioned to make a drawing of make a painting in a church in Cyprus of the Kyrenia II, which is a replica of the Kyrenia ship that you saw the amphora sticking out in one of the slides. This painter had visited the Kyrenia II, this reconstructed hull, while they were building it. He saw it afloat, and yet Harry, in this wonderful article, which isn't very long, and I can give it to anybody who wants to read it, comes up with, I think, 26 differences between what ended up on the church wall and the actual Kyrenia ship. And it included things like, for example, on the Kyrenia ship, they just had a white sail, right? Here you had, I forget if it's either a cross or Mary, an image of Mary. There were all sorts of religious things that were added there. There were errors, there were things that you know, the ship could not have sailed without them, and yet he didn't include them. So again, iconography, very valuable, but trust and verify. Is there anybody on? Okay.
So do we have any more comments or questions?
And again, I apologize for, I noticed that I wasn't synchronizing exactly the two computer.
Well, let's thank Shelley again for a great lecture. And I also want to thank Lauren Clark for all the logistics that have gone into this, including the cookies. So